Hi there, this is Josh from Literary Gladiators, and today I'm here with a book tag. The tag that I'm going to be doing is an Independence Day book tag. It was created by Steve Donahue. I was tagged to do this by Mark from Richardson Reads. The reason that I'm releasing it today, August 2nd, is because, with the exception of John Hancock, who was certain of his allegiance to this Declaration of Independence, the other signers of the Declaration of Independence did so on August 2nd. So, since Steve Donahue released this tag on July 4th, and I didn't get tagged until after, I thought it would be a good idea to do it on August 2nd, the day that most of the signers signed the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to get into the questions. I don't necessarily agree with the direction in which they're going, but I'm going to answer them for their face value. First one is George Washington. The most overrated book you've ever read. And I wouldn't say George Washington's overrated. I think that he was the ultimate independent. I think he really did help shape the United States and the presidency. I think that he had his... I think there were things that people built up. George Washington wasn't the most presentable individual. He was a very reserved and a very not as... he didn't have that valiant air. He was much more soft-spoken, as people, more so than people made out of him. But the most overrated book I have ever read is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. This is a really mixed book. There are people that really love it, and there are people that really hate it. And I am part of the class that cannot stand this book because, while the voice of Christopher John Francis Boone was very interesting, the approach that he took, but the story within itself really, it came off as somewhat stereotypical and an assumption for what people like Christopher are like, and his parents were probably the worst that I've ever come across in any work of literature that I've read. Next one is John Adams. The most argumentative book you've ever read, and I would say that this is pretty accurate of a description for John Adams. I would say that among the Founding Fathers, John Adams had the loudest presence among them. The most argumentative book I've ever read, though, is Soda Politics, Taking on Big Soda and Winning by Dr. Marion Nestle, because I felt that Soda Politics really made me think about the soda industry and how infuriating their actions really are, and their influence on the authorities, and how their billions of trillions of dollars are able to influence the laws that are made and do so in their favor. Next one is Samuel Adams. The most underrated book you've ever read. I don't know so much about Samuel Adams, but I definitely want to learn more. I'm familiar with the beer or ale that takes his name. But most underrated book that I think people should read is This Side of Time, a poetry collection by Ko-Un, and it's translated by Claire Yu and Richard Silberg. Ko-un is just able to say so much with so few words and make such a long-lasting impact. Next one is Abigail Adams, a secondary character who probably could have handled things as well as the main characters. And I think Abigail Adams was a very powerful force, especially with being an influence on her husband, and she even had an influence on John Adams and Thomas Jefferson speaking again, because they were on and off constantly. They had a great rivalry. They were friends, they were enemies. By the end of their lives, they were friends again, and I think Abigail Adams had a lot to do with that. But I chose Dr. Pascal Rogan from the Rogan McCourt series by Emile Zola. Pascal is a doctor. His siblings have more authoritative roles, and they seem to be detached to society, and I feel that Pascal serves as an enlightening voice of reason, and after reading this, he was by far my favorite character in the book. Next one is Thomas Jefferson, the most hypocritical book you've ever read, and this is probably the question that I would have a bit of a disagreement with. I'm going to answer the question as it is presented, but while Thomas Jefferson was opposed to abolition but owned slaves, just about any Southern statesman, politician, just individual, owning slaves was something that Southern people did because it was their way of producing the resources that kept them prevalent. I'm against abolition and the mistreatment of any form of individual, but to lay the idea of any president owning slaves on Thomas Jefferson alone is something that you can't do, because so many of them did that. And Thomas Jefferson, it was a bit contradictory that he was a huge supporter of states' rights and against a forceful executive rule and a suffocating federal government. But when he became president, he exercised executive order pretty frequently. But I do think that the decisions that he made were crucial to America. The Louisiana Purchase was crucial. His exploration into the West through the Lewis and Clark expedition, and his great influence on making American culture and not a new wave of British culture were essential. And I think that Thomas Jefferson, if you want to word it that way, is the grand classic liberal. But the book that I chose for the most hypocritical book, that's My Dog Tulip by J.R. Ackerley. Because this gentleman, Ackerley himself, he was not a perfect individual, but he had a great deal of expectations for his German Shepherd or his Alsatian Tulip. In actuality, her name was Queenie, but Ackerley didn't want to make mention to that because he himself was a gay man, and to use the real name would bring unwanted attention onto himself. But the expectations that he had for this dog, he just spent the whole time talking about the dog's inability to reproduce properly or become a good mother. And I think that the fact that he was unable to live up to particular expectations that people may have of him, and him placing that on the dog, was a bit too extreme. The next one is Benjamin Franklin, the book by the oldest author you've read. Steve Donahue said that for most people it would be Herman Wouk, and I have read Herman Wouk. I read The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. They were both really solid books, and Herman Wouk is really continuing to go strong. He is starting to show age, but he's still writing, even if they're just journal entries as we speak. But I found somebody older and still living, and that is Boris Pahor, who wrote Necropolis, which is a Holocaust story. Pahor was Slovenian born, or he was born in the country that is now known as Slovenia. But during the Second World War, he initially fought with the Axis powers, but because he wanted to remain with his native people, he started fighting against them, and he was arrested and placed in a concentration camp. Not as extreme as the Jewish people, but it was still pretty heinous and immoral, the things that were going on. And this is such a powerful story that he tells, and he really does a great job with his strategy of talking about a visit that he made and then providing us with flashbacks of the things that took place. But where Herman Wouk is 103, Boris Pahor is going to be 105 at the end of the month. He was born in 1913. And from what I read in current events, there was something earlier this year where there was something political going on, and Boris Pahor was sitting in and giving his 2 cents, and if anything, showing his presence. Next one is Alexander Hamilton, the least charismatic but important book you've ever read. I would say that Alexander Hamilton is the complete opposite of Thomas Jefferson. Where Jefferson was a strong proponent for states' rights, Alexander Hamilton was the key voice for a strong central federal government. And he also created the New York Post in order to express his thoughts and opinions, which I'm more of a Thomas Jefferson fan than I am an Alexander Hamilton fan. But that's just what I think. I'd like to read biographies and having to do with Hamilton. But the one that I chose for that is Jacob von Gutten by Robert Walser, which to many people, they're going to they can easily become bored out of their minds reading this, but if you look deeply into his character, and you look deeply into the situation at hand, and you look deeply into the reasoning that he gives, you begin to feel quite enlightened and realize that Robert Walser was an absurdist genius who really thought outside of the box with his writing, and it really makes you think about the world around us and how it operates at the hands of human nature. The next one is John Hancock, the most charismatic but least important book you've ever read. Granted, John Hancock, he's known most for signing the Declaration of Independence with the largest, most attractive signature, because he was confident of his allegiance, and he wanted King George III to know this. King George III and his not-so-good vision. But for that I chose On the Road by Jack Kerouac, filled with a great deal of hot air and cocky confidence, but Sal Paradise has absolutely no idea what he's doing, bumbling around, and just figuring out what he wants to do with his life, but constantly going back and forth to not so good influences, particularly that of Dean Moriarty. But it is semi-autobiographical with whom everyone is based off of, particularly Kerouac being Sal Paradise. Next one is Paul Revere, a book that alerted you to something. And if you want to talk about somebody that really is given far more importance than they really entailed, it's Paul Revere. I think Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has a lot to do with Paul Revere's notoriety, because his poem about the Midnight Ride, or Paul Revere's Ride, in order to rile people up to come together to support the cause of the Civil War. Because of this, Paul Revere is known heavily for allegedly shouting the British are coming, when in actuality he never said such a thing. He said there were plenty of other people that were involved. They said something more along the lines of the regulars are coming out. And then ultimately he and a few other people were arrested after this incident. I'll actually bring that up in a discussion that we had about Longfellow's poem about Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But the book that alerted me to something is 1 Second After by William R. Forstchen, which, it was not a good book. It was probably the most predictable book I've ever read, but it did alert me to the idea of EMPs hitting, which it is a horrific event, especially because if they do hit, there are no electronics, there are no anything that relies on consistent power, but particularly anything pertaining to electricity, and even if somebody relies on an IV, oxygen, anything that any of those appendages will all be gone, and people with that need particular resources of that nature will not be able to survive as long. Steve Donahue makes mention to that in the canned food book tag that he did, that I tagged him in, but he makes mention to what you should have if for some reason something drastic of that nature happens. That was the first time that I was alerted to something of that nature, and I know that Newt Gingrich was the only presidential candidate that I could think of that brought that up in any which way, which it makes sense that Gingrich is the one that has something to say about it, because he has written with William R. Forstchen. There is a sequel to this book. I have yet to read it. I don't know if I will read it, but that is something that we really need to think about. And that was probably the only good thing about the book. It alerted me to something, but the story was not very good. The next one is James Madison, the smartest boring book you've ever read. I would say that John Steinbeck's books, but in particular The Grapes of Wrath, are smart boring books per se, because John Steinbeck alternates between telling the story and then explaining the setting, which seems to be a habit of his in his longer books, where he spends a chapter talking about the setting as in the geographical appearance, the place and time, and it does create a sense of a drag to the story, but the stories themselves are incredibly fascinating, and knowing a bit about the setting is helpful. He does do this in East of Eden, but I think that it is far more evident in The Grapes of Wrath. But it's necessary with how they are constantly switching the setting because of their journey west. And that is it for the Independence Day book tag. It is belated, but it is here. I'm not going to tag anybody, but if anybody's interested in doing this and has an interest in the Founding Fathers, or if anybody wants to explore them a bit more, I encourage you to do this tag. Thank you for tuning into this video, and for now, keep reading.